Some disappearances leave an impossible emptiness. No clues, no suspects, just the slow erosion of certainty. Others leave a tangled trail of lies, forged documents and concealed identities that, years later, can be pulled apart by a single stubborn clue. Today's first story is of the latter kind. A child declared dead in a house fire in 1997, and a mother who, years later, refused to accept the official account until a chance sighting and a single strand of hair began an unraveling that rewrote a family's history. Philadelphia, 1997. A row house with a front stoop and a narrow hallway, the kind of ordinary domestic address recorded in police logs on a humid summer night. At some point in that night, the house burned. The medical examiner determined an infant named Delmar, born just weeks earlier, died in the blaze. Fire damage, smoke inhalation, a short, devastating entry in the family's calendar. Investigators closed the case as a tragic, accidental death by fire. For most of those involved, time moved on. Not for one woman. In public records, she appears only under initials, LSE. Her full name is indefinido in those records available to reporters. In court filings, she is identified by those initials. What is clear is the shape of a doubt that would not be quieted. Where the official narrative held, LSE felt something else, a wrongness. The idea that the infant's death had been settled so quickly did not fit the way a parent carries a child in their mind. The small roundness of a cheek, the particular way a child reaches for a thumb. Doubt is not evidence. Doubt is a force. For 6 years LSE carried that force. She raised questions with friends, revisited the scene in her head, and watched people in her life the way someone watches a mirror searching for a crack. Then, in 2003, at a neighborhood gathering, she saw a child who stopped her heart. The boy was about 6 with a shy look and a way of tilting his head that matched the memory LSE had kept alive. She later described the moment in small, precise terms, an internal click, a sudden recognition so sharp she could not ignore it. She did what one human being can do when certainty is absent, but suspicion is rising. She kept quiet, she observed, and then she collected what she could. That what she could turned out to be a strand of hair. It is an image both ordinary and extraordinary. A woman folding into her pocket a hair, an almost trivial object that would become pivotal. At the time, forensic science presented a technical problem. A hair without its root, the bulb at the base, cannot yield nuclear DNA, the genetic code used to make conclusive parent-child matches. Without the root, investigators could run tests for mitochondrial DNA, which can offer clues about maternal lineage, but not the kind of definitive link that prosecutors and families rely on. That limitation meant the early sample could not settle anything by itself. Police were alerted, and the investigation that followed moved through the slow, often bureaucratic machinations of law enforcement. Interviews, scene checks, attempts to place the child in the household records, questions about the adults who had access to him. The child was being raised under a different identity, the boy known in the community as Alia Hernandez. Public records later showed a name on a birth certificate that did not match state records for the infant who had been declared dead. That birth certificate, it would emerge, was falsified. The woman who had raised the child was known as Carolyn, in court documents available to the press. Her last name in certain sources is indefinido, in others it is present but often blurred in archival reports. She worked at a pharmacy, an ordinary job, one that required trust and regular proximity to medical supplies. To those who knew her superficially, she was an acquaintance who had become a caregiver. To investigators, as the pieces accumulated, she became a central figure whose actions required explanation. Early investigative work turned on 2 parallel lines. One was documentary, the birth certificate, school records, anything that could corroborate the child's legal identity. The other was scientific, biological samples that could link the child to LSE or to the father named in the original record, a man identified as Pedro in those reports. Pedro's full name is indefinido in the accessible public files. In interviews, he denied involvement. Denials, especially from those close to a case, are a human response that investigators must weigh alongside evidence, not replace it. The breakthrough arrived in 2004. but it did not appear fully formed. Investigators sought a sample that would allow testing of nuclear DNA. The hair, again hair without root, had been useful as a lead, but insufficient as proof. Detectives moved cautiously, securing saliva samples from the child and from Carolyn. Saliva contains epithelial cells shed from the mouth. Those cells carry nuclear DNA, the standard material for parentage testing and identity confirmation. Where a hair shaft without a root cannot provide the nuclear DNA needed for a high-confidence match, a saliva swab is straightforward. It preserves the same genetic blueprint that appears in blood or tissue samples, and modern testing can compare profiles across multiple loci to produce a match expressed in odds so astronomically high they leave little room for random coincidence. The sample processing and chain of custody became crucial. Defense teams and prosecutors alike know that an evidentiary win can be undercut by sloppy collection or questionable handling. There were, according to court transcripts and news coverage, attempts to disrupt the testing. Reports indicate Carolyn took steps that investigators described as efforts to tamper with or confound the results, alleged actions that would be considered obstruction if proven. The records show prosecutors alleged improprieties. Defense counsel disputed some characterizations. Those details matter because they force questions about motive, cover, and the lengths to which someone might go to keep an assumed identity intact. When the tests were run, the results were decisive. The child being raised as Aaliyah Hernandez was biologically the missing infant, Delmar Vera. The DNA linked the boy to LSE and, according to the profile, to Pedro as the biological father. These were not close probabilities. Forensic parentage analysis expresses results in terms of likelihood ratios and exclusionary data. The arresting fact was that decades of paperwork preparation and a constructed life were unraveled by the scientific certainty of a saliva match. The public documents that followed read like a legal chronology. Prosecutors charged Carolyn with arson, kidnapping, and attempted murder, among other counts. In court, she entered a plea of no contest on certain charges. Legally, a plea of no contest, nolo contendere, means the defendant does not formally admit guilt, but accepts the sentence. It is treated similarly to a guilty plea for purposes of sentencing, but it generally cannot be used as an admission of liability in subsequent civil proceedings. It's a procedural route that resolves a criminal case without a trial verdict, and it can be chosen for strategic reasons that range from minimizing publicity to avoiding testimony that could be used in civil actions. The sentence imposed was significant. Carolyn received a term of years, reported in media records as between 9 and 30 years. Sentences like this reflect both the statutory ranges for the charges and judicial discretion, which considers aggravating and mitigating factors. They are not moral explanations, they are legal outcomes that close one chapter of formal accountability while leaving other questions unresolved. What the law could decide in a courtroom was only part of the story. The human consequences that followed were neither clean nor conclusive. When Delmar, who had been living as Aaliyah, returned to the fold of his biological family, the transition was stormy and fragile. Children removed from a caregiver and placed into a family they have not known must navigate language, loyalty, trauma, and trust. Reports and interviews in later years describe periods in foster care, questions about neglect and abuse that occurred during the years he lived with Carolyn, and a series of placements that complicated any linear narrative of rescue. As an adult, Delmar's path toward stability involved distance, self-redefinition, and, according to some accounts, a degree of recovery from early harms. Those details are not presented to titillate. They are the human cost documented in court files and family interviews. The child at the center of this legal drama was always a person first, a tiny life whose contours were redrawn without his consent. The father, Pedro, remained a figure who publicly denied involvement. Denial does not equal innocence, and silence does not equal guilt. Courts look for proof, not sentiment. In this case, DNA provided one kind of proof about biological connection. It did not and could not explain motive. Why would a caregiver go to the lengths of forging a birth certificate and raising a child as her own? Why did a fire occur in 1997, that at the time sufficed to explain the child's death. These remain partially unresolved. Investigators and journalists assembled theories, some grounded in documented interactions, others speculative about personal desperation or long-term manipulation, but none offered a fully proven motive accepted by all parties. Public interest in the case extended beyond the courtroom. The story inspired a film in 2008 that dramatized parts of the ordeal. More recently, in 2024, a documentary revisited the events with archival footage and interviews that tried to capture the emotional complexity of those involved. Popular culture's attention complicates private grief. Documentaries can bring resources and renewed scrutiny, and dramatic films often compress or simplify nuanced experiences into digestible narratives. Members of the family have had to live under the spotlight that comes with media retellings, another burden layered on top of the original harm. Throughout the inquiry, the tools of forensics played a starring role. That single hair, first gathered at a party in 2003, was a trace that lit the path forward. If it had contained a root, the case might have moved earlier. Because it didn't, investigators had to pivot, to collect saliva, and to negotiate the legal hurdles of obtaining samples from a child raised under another identity. The scientific realities matter in two ways. They can vindicate a long-held suspicion, and they can expose how fragile official narratives can be when not continually scrutinized. But the science is clinical. The aftermath is human. The reunification process did not neatly stitch the family back together. Relationships frayed under accumulated betrayals and years of absence. There were allegations of abuse and failures in the foster care apparatus, reported, contested, sometimes ambiguous. The child grew, changed names, and faced the social consequences of being thrust into a public story. Even with legal closure on some counts, emotional closure remained elusive. And then there are the unresolved threads that resist tidy endings. Did Carolyn act alone? What, if any, accomplices or enablers existed? Was the fire in 1997 incendiarism designed to conceal an abduction, or was it a genuine accident later exploited for a cover story? Those are questions with partial answers at best. Some remain marked indefinido in the public record, facts that require further verification or simply do not exist outside the memories of those who lived them. The case offers a portrait of how ordinary domestic life can be weapons-grade in its ordinariness. A neighbor, a pharmacy clerk, a woman who knows the rhythms of families and children, none of those roles are dramatic in themselves. Yet the trust bound up in them is what can be manipulated. Investigators in this case had to untangle layers of falsified documents, parental claims and circumstantial consistencies to find what the science could prove. There are also procedural lessons embedded here about the limits and strengths of different types of evidence. A hair shaft without a root points to the usefulness and limitation of mitochondrial DNA testing. Mitochondrial DNA can show maternal lineage and exclude certain relationships, but it cannot usually provide a nuclear DNA match with the statistical specificity required to convict or to settle contested paternity in court. Saliva, by contrast, is a workhorse for nuclear DNA profiling. It is the difference between a suggestive clue and a match that will stand up under the pressure of cross-examination. That scientific reality reshaped the investigation's arc, from suspicion and paperwork to biological confirmation. In the middle of these technical details is the human cost again. Families who live for years without answers often experience a particular cruelty. A closure that is legal does not undo lived harm. For LSE, the vindication of seeing her child again came bundled with the trauma of what he had lived through and of the long years stolen from both of them. For the child, Aaliyah, Delmar, the identity upheaval meant reconstructing a self around names, memories, and relationships that had been imposed and then unstitched. There are practical outcomes too. The case prompted local authorities and advocacy groups to look more closely at how missing child reports are handled, at the way records can be manipulated, and at the importance of maintaining open channels between community tips and forensic follow-up. It prompted conversations about how a single eyewitness's intuition, the internal click LSE described, can and should be honored as a lead worthy of scientific corroboration, not dismissed as mere sentiment. Even with a sentence imposed and documents corrected, the story resisted simple closure. Legal consequences operate in a defined space: statutes, pleas, sentencing ranges. Emotional consequences do not obey those borders. Families continue to file civil claims, to seek therapy, to tell their children stories about what happened and why. Public fascination with the case turned into a cautionary tale about the instability of identity, when paperwork is falsified, and about the power of forensic science to reverse decades of assumed facts. And yet, for all the clarity DNA brought in 2004, certain fundamental questions remained: why the abduction happened, who might have helped, and what, if anything, the burned house in 1997 actually concealed. Some of those questions were indefinido in the files available for public review. Others might exist in sealed reports, in memories of people who no longer wish to speak, or in paperwork that has been lost or destroyed. The unraveling in this Philadelphia case demonstrates the peculiar morality of modern investigations. Science can prove identity and disprove the narrative that comforted officials in 1997, but it cannot always explain motive or heal the scars left on those who were taken from time itself. It also shows the role of persistence, of a mother who would not let a document or a coroner's note become the final word on her child's fate. Sometimes recognition arrives in a crowd. Sometimes it arrives as a single hair in a pocket. But not every disappearance ends with the authoritative click of a DNA match. Not every family gets that fragile, partial, legal vindication. There are other disappearances, older, colder, full of circumstantial hints, but lacking the biological trace that would close a case. In those stories, investigators must rely on different tools: profiles, timelines, witness recollections, patterns of violent behavior. The next case moves into that territory, where a known predator lived nearby, where trampled flower beds and an emptied purse suggest an abrupt departure, and where decades of suspicion did not equal a sealed courtroom verdict. Before we turn to that second story, a brief note. If this type of unraveling, where science upends a lifetime of assumptions, catches your attention, subscribe for deeper looks at cases like these. The next story we'll explore shifts from a DNA-led resolution to the far tougher work of chasing circumstantial threads and confronting the limits of what investigators can prove decades after a disappearance. The morning Sandy Horwit did not get up. The house did not look like a crime scene, at least not at first glance. It looked like the ordinary disorder of a lived-in home. Beds unmade, toys or notes left out, the small domestic textures that make a place feel lived in. What immediately stood out were absences: a purse gone from a familiar hook, a checkbook missing from a drawer, the front flower beds trampled as if someone had crossed them in a hurry. There was no sign of forced entry on the doors. There were no apparent scuffles up close. Those gaps, what was present and what was not, set the tone for an investigation that would knot frustration and grief together for decades. It was October 1973 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Sandy was a mother of three, Robin, Tammy, and Becky, who would later describe the strange normalcy of that morning with a clarity that made the scene ache. They called neighbors, they fanned out, they phoned police. Officers treated the disappearance with the sort of alarm called for when an adult vanishes from a home without explanation, especially a mother with young children. The initial searches turned up little. Footprints were inconclusive. A neighbor recalled hearing a vehicle leaving in the night but could not identify it, and the trampled flower beds suggested a sudden departure rather than a slow disappearance. The missing purse and checkbook raised questions about robbery or a hurried trip, but if robbery were the motive, it did not follow the patterns detectives often expect. There were no signs of a ransacked interior, nothing that resembled the sort of violent struggle witnessed in many robberies gone wrong. Investigators constructed and tested a range of hypotheses. Could Sandy have left voluntarily? The family found that idea untenable. Her checkbook and schedule suggested routine errands, not an intention to vanish. Were there clues in her relationships, recent conflicts, financial pressure, a new attachment? Nothing in the public record indicated a clear motive to leave. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed acquaintances, and set up searches along nearby roads and wooded areas. Yet every lead cooled. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. For the daughters, each unanswered question hardened into a living ache. Where was their mother? And who could have taken her from a sleeping home? A few elements of the early investigation acquired disproportionate weight precisely because they were concrete: the missing items, the trampled beds, and a neighbor's testimony. One witness heard something, a disturbance, a vehicle, not long before sunrise. That testimony later assumed significance when investigators tightened the perimeter of the case. It suggested a narrow window of time during which someone could have left the house with intent and perhaps with speed. Law enforcement searched a radius that extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. They turned up no abandoned car or eyewitness, placing a stranger with the mother. The absence of those connecting threads mattered as much as any positive evidence. Sometimes the thing that is not there tells as clear a story as the thing that is. Into that absence stepped a person who would loom over the case for years: Gary Addison Taylor. Taylor's name appears in the case file as a man whose behavior and later criminal activity made him an obvious person of interest. He lived in the area at the time of Sandy's disappearance, and according to records available to the public, moved away not long after. In subsequent years, Taylor was convicted of violent crimes against women in other jurisdictions. Investigators later uncovered bodies on property he had occupied at a different time. Those discoveries confirmed patterns of violent behavior in his past, and they made him a focal point for those hoping to link him conclusively to Sandy. But suspicion alone is not proof. The gap between suspicion and conviction is a structural necessity in a justice system designed to avoid wrongful condemnation. When bodies were found on property tied to Taylor, they were of two females. Sandy's remains were not among them. Taylor faced convictions elsewhere for killings to which he sometimes allegedly confessed. Accounts differ, and some confessions were partial or later disputed. But in the case of Sandy Horwit, there was no body, no direct forensic match, and no confession that placed him at the scene. He denied involvement in her disappearance, and later in life he refused interviews that might have clarified lingering questions. His denials did not erase the circumstantial weight of his pattern of violence. They did, however, ensure the case retained its essential, excruciating uncertainty. Investigators tried to build a bridge between pattern and particular. They ran timelines. Where had Taylor been on the night Sandy vanished? When had he last been seen in the neighborhood? Did he have contacts with the Horwit family? They combed through rental records, property deeds, and the kinds of small administrative paper trails that sometimes betray movements otherwise forgotten. They interviewed neighbors again and again, seeking a detail that might have been overlooked. Profilers examined Taylor's criminal history and behavioral patterns to assess whether his known methods matched the circumstances of Sandy's go-missing: a sudden departure with personal items left behind, a lack of overt struggle, and the apparent absence of sexual assault evidence in the immediate home scene reported then. Profilers noted consistencies in how some predators operate: opportunism, selecting a vulnerable victim at a predictable time, and cleaning up or concealing evidence in ways that delay discovery. Those are patterns, not proof. They can justify investigative focus, but not a legal conclusion. For the Horwit daughters, every partial match tightened the wound. They learned early in the investigation that the simplest human acts, calling in tips, giving police statements, waiting by a phone for updates, could become a kind of daily betrayal as leads went cold. They took solace where they could: a detective's attention, a fresh tip, a re-examination of an old witness. They also learned the procedural limits of police work: budgets, jurisdictional headaches, competing caseloads that meant cold cases sometimes slipped from hot priority to ongoing file. Frustration with that institutional slowness is common in families of the missing. It compounds grief with a sense of being in effect invisible. Periodically, the case would receive renewed public interest, usually sparked by a new development elsewhere in law enforcement, connected to Taylor's crimes. When investigators uncovered bodies on property linked to Taylor, the daughters and the detectives hoped the forensic work might reveal a link to Sandy: missing teeth, clothing fibers, clothing washes that could be paired to an event in 1973, or witness testimony refreshed by time. But those hopes met the hard arithmetic of evidence. Bodies found years later, can bear traces that help identify them, but connecting them to a single disappearance from a different time and place requires specific, corroborating markers. In Sandy's case, the biological traces necessary to perform such a match were absent from the locations where material was recovered, or the material that might have existed was no longer preserved in a way that permitted definitive testing. The passage of time had worn away the kinds of evidence that modern science could use. That limitation exposes the cruel contingency of cold case work. Forensic science has advanced in remarkable ways. Nuclear DNA testing, touch DNA, and more recently, investigative genetic genealogy have rewritten the capacities of detectives. But these tools are only as strong as the samples available. If a body is never found, if the crime scene was not preserved in a way that captures usable DNA, or if decades of handling and environmental exposure have degraded material, the investigative options shrink. In Sandy's case, the lack of biological material connecting Taylor, or anyone else, to her disappearance meant the case would remain in the realm of suspicion and theory. The family pressed for answers through the years in the ways families always do: public appeals, anniversaries that brought media attention, and persistent requests for review. They engaged private investigators at times, they revisited old leads, and they participated in re-interviews when law enforcement reopened inquiries. Each renewed search yielded a mixture of hope and disappointment. For the daughters, the absence of finality meant a life lived in a half-world, functionally adult and yet tethered to a childhood that had been split by an unresolved loss. They aged with the case. The case did not age into neat closure. Journalists who covered the story had to balance the public's appetite for answers with the ethical obligations laid out in the case file. Avoid sensationalizing unproven allegations, use language like suspected or alleged, where culpability had not been adjudicated, and respect the privacy of a family that had endured enough spotlight to feel bruising rather than comforting. That careful, restrained reporting did not lessen public interest. If anything, it deepened the tragedy. The more prudence the press exercised in describing suspected links to Taylor, the more painfully obvious it became that suspicion alone did not constitute the justice the family craved. There were procedural obstacles that made it harder to reach the evidentiary standard required for prosecution. Records from the early 1970s were not always digitized or systematically preserved. Witness memories faded. Civilian tipsters moved away or passed on. Law enforcement priorities shifted over time, particularly as departments faced higher-volume violent crimes demanding immediate resources. All of these factors are ordinary bureaucratic realities with extraordinary human consequences. Lost notes, an overlooked lead, a missing sample stored improperly can mean the difference between a case that can be prosecuted and a case that can only be mourned. It is important to underscore what did and did not happen regarding Taylor and Sandy in ways that honor both factual accuracy and the family's lived experience. Taylor was convicted for violent crimes in other cases. Those convictions are part of the public record. The bodies found on property connected to Taylor were not identified as Sandy's in the public material available to reporters. Her remains were not among those recovered. Taylor denied that he had anything to do with Sandy's disappearance, and he later declined to provide information that might clarify the unanswered questions. Given those facts, law enforcement retained Taylor as a suspect, but lacked the direct proof necessary to charge him in Sandy's disappearance. That is the strict, somber arithmetic of the case, an abundance of reason to suspect, yet an absence of proof sufficient to meet the criminal standard. Families of missing persons often face the dual burden of private grief and public management of their loss. For Robin, Tammy, and Becky, the years became a continuous cycle of remembrance and investigation, of birthdays and anniversaries observed under the shadow of the unanswered question. They coped in different ways: advocacy, outreach to the media, cooperation with detectives, and a refusal to let Sandy's absence become a matter of quiet forgetting. Their insistence kept the file alive. It is not unusual for families to do the work that institutions sometimes cannot sustain. Their persistence can become the most durable engine for cold case continuity. Across the decades, some investigative methods evolved. Cold case units learned to inventory and preserve evidence with forensic possibility in mind. Police departments began to partner with external labs to retest physical materials with newer methods and to use behavioral analysis to prioritize cases where those methods might succeed. In some jurisdictions, genetic genealogy emerged as a new pathway to connect anonymous DNA to a family line, producing leads in previously intractable homicides and disappearances. But genetic genealogy depends on the existence of an unknown DNA profile to upload to public databases. It cannot reconstruct an individual's existence where there is no DNA at all. In Sandy's case, much of the scene did not produce the kind of preserved material that would make such techniques feasible. The unresolved status of the case has consequences that go beyond any single investigation. It changes how a community thinks about safety and trust. A neighbor's glance that once seemed ordinary becomes charged with possibility. The knowledge that a known violent offender lived nearby and later committed crimes elsewhere reframes an entire neighborhood's memory of the time. Small moments, a car idling, a person leaving in the night, gain new weight. Those shifts in communal perception are part of the longer social cost of unresolved disappearances. They erode confidence in public spaces and complicate interpersonal relations. There is also an ethical dimension to retelling this kind of story. Responsible reporting and narration must avoid turning a family's pain into entertainment. It must also refrain from granting the moral certainty of guilt where law and evidence require restraint. Recounting Taylor's later crimes is necessary because it bears on why investigators focused on him. But it is equally necessary to state plainly that in the case of Sandy Horwit, no definitive link was established in public records and that the search for answers remains open. This duality, acknowledging the plausibility of a suspect's involvement while humbly admitting the limits of what has been proven, is uncomfortable, but it is essential to honest investigative storytelling. What then does this case tell us about the general problem of disappearances that feel creepy in an everyday way? First, proximity to danger often masquerades as ordinariness. A perpetrator who lives or works near the victim can exploit the routine trust embedded in neighborly relations. Second, the presence of circumstantial clues, trampled beds, missing personal items, a suspicious neighbor, can point strongly toward foul play without being enough on their own to secure a conviction. Third, advances in forensic science, while powerful, are not a guarantee. They require preserved evidence, and they cannot answer questions when the requisite physical traces are missing. Finally, families bear the emotional aftermath in ways the justice system cannot fully remedy. Even when a suspect is convicted elsewhere, the absence of a direct legal resolution for the specific loved one remains a sharply felt loss. Comparing the two stories underlines these lessons. In Philadelphia, a strand of hair collected by an instinctive parent at a neighborhood gathering set in motion a chain of events that culminated in saliva tests, a DNA match, and a courtroom plea that closed certain legal questions. The forensic arc there: hair leads to saliva, saliva to nuclear DNA, DNA to identity, illustrates how a tiny, preserved sample can pivot an investigation from doubt to decisive identification. That case shows how modern evidence can reverse an official narrative and restore, at least partially and imperfectly, a family's factual history. In Ann Arbor, the absence of such a trace kept the case in the colder registers of suspicion and theory. Here, the investigative tools were different: behavioral analysis, timelines, neighbor testimony, and the circumspect work of connecting patterns across jurisdictions. Those methods can strongly implicate a suspect and can inform prosecutorial decisions when the right mix of corroborating material emerges. But without the biologic anchor that nuclear DNA often provides, the case remained unresolved in the way that wounds remain unhealed. Both stories also share a darker communal truth. Ordinary trust, neighbors, acquaintances, caregivers, can both sustain life and conceal harm. In one instance, trust was weaponized and later exposed by science. In the other, trust was shadowed by suspicion that could not be converted into legal certainty. For families on each side of these narratives, the consequences are visceral and enduring. What can be learned practically from this comparison? For law enforcement, the lesson is twofold. First, treat family leads, those instinctive moments of recognition, with procedural respect. Preserve even peripheral physical traces, because what looks inconsequential today may be decisive tomorrow. Second, invest in the long-term preservation of evidence and the careful documentation of witness statements. Time corrodes physical materials and memories alike. For communities and individuals, the lesson is vigilance married to care. Look out for neighbors, report anomalies, and take seriously the small intuitions that, taken together, can point to something larger. There are also unanswered questions still hanging over Sandy's disappearance that, in fairness, belong to the realm of verified record rather than conjecture. Certain specifics, exact timelines of Taylor's moves in 1973 relative to the disappearance, the full content of every interview conducted at the time, and other archival documents remain indefinido in accessible public records and may require formal review or release to clarify. Where documents are sealed or lost, families and investigators sometimes press for judicial review or freedom of information requests to recover the administrative history that could illuminate gaps. That process can be slow, but it has produced results in other cold cases. It is a reminder that unresolved disappearances are often resolvable in part through persistent legal and bureaucratic work, as much as through forensic breakthroughs. For the Horwit daughters, the passage of years did not blunt the urgency of their search. It changed its texture. In the early years, the work was active: search parties, tip lines, direct appeals. Later, it settled into a sustained insistence: keep the file open, periodically re-examine leads, and ensure that whatever evidence exists is preserved for the day when new techniques might make a different kind of inquiry possible. That kind of latent hope is not the same as certainty, but it is not resignation either. It is a form of stewardship on behalf of a missing loved one. When we step back from the particulars and look at the wider pattern these cases reveal, the human cost becomes a kind of ledger we do not want to balance. The law can remedy some wrongs: convictions, sentences, documented accountability. For families, legal outcomes are sometimes a settlement with history, but they rarely close the emotional ledger. The sense of betrayal, the ordinary everyday person who becomes suspected of extraordinary harm, leaves a kind of social scar. It reshapes how survivors and communities see each other. That scar is not visible, but it is real. Unraveling these disappearances is not ultimately about solving a puzzle for entertainment. It's about insisting on the dignity of those who are gone and on the lives that continue to live in the wake of a missing person's absence. In one story, forensics reconstituted a stolen identity. In the other, pattern and suspicion pointed to a likely perpetrator who was never definitively linked. Both outcomes matter, because both make us ask how systems, legal, investigative, and communal, might better prevent, detect, and resolve such breaches of trust. If you have information related to either of these cases, or to a cold case that needs renewed attention, consider contacting your local law enforcement agency or a dedicated cold case unit. For those following these stories at a remove, there are quieter actions that matter too. Donate to organizations that support families of the missing, press local authorities to preserve and reopen critical evidence when warranted, and treat public appeals with the sensitivity and restraint families deserve. These disappearances, one unraveled, one unresolved, leave a shared legacy. They remind us that our ordinary neighborhoods can hide violence, that forensic advances can rewrite long-held conclusions, and that even when courts provide one form of closure, the human story continues in fractured families and haunted anniversaries. Remembering the victims by their names, by the facts that are known, and by the questions that remain, is not only a way to honor them, it is a civic act of keeping those losses in public view so that justice remains possible. If this exploration mattered to you, leave a comment suggesting other disappearances you think deserve a careful re-examination, and check the description for sources and links to ways you can support families of the missing. Subscribe if you want thoughtful, careful investigations, delivered with respect for victims and without sensationalism. Above all, hold the victims in mind, not as mysteries to be solved for curiosity's sake, but as people whose absence calls for persistent inquiry and humane remembrance.